Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Squire Patton Boggs. We're delighted to have all of you here today. I'm Ed Newberry, Global Managing Partner for Policy here at the firm. And my note here says, welcome to our timely discussion. I can't think of any more timely discussion than this discussion today, given all that's happened. We have a great panel here, and I'm going to introduce just two of the members of the panel to start, and you'll hear from all of them as we go. First, Ambassador Matthew Kirk. Ambassador Kirk is one of our colleagues in our London office, a former UK diplomat, somebody who studies the Brexit process carefully. In fact, I was on the phone with him yesterday when he told me what he thought was going to happen, and while we were on the phone, what he thought was going to happen actually happened. So he's very good. And our colleague Jeremy Corbyn, also from our UK office, our London office in UK, who will be your moderator today. The implications of Brexit, all of you know, are enormous. They have enormous implications for the UK, for all of Europe, for the United States as well. There'll be free trade negotiations and all kinds of issues that come out of this process whenever this process actually is completed. And I think there's a big and open question on that front as well. So I'm just delighted all of you are here. We're delighted to welcome you to Squire Patton Boggs. We hope you'll find this informative and helpful to all of your businesses. And with that, I'll introduce Jeremy Corbyn, who will be your moderator today. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you very much, Ed. Mr. Ambassador, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our seminar today entitled Boris's Brexit, a roadmap to a new US-UK free trade agreement, ? We've been debating for about a year when was the best time to hold this event. So the challenge of advising on Brexit-related matters, which we've been doing for clients across the globe since 2016, is that while events are capable of moving very quickly indeed, the key messages have remained largely the same. Message 1, it's complicated, and message 2, it's unclear. Frequently, we've been led to believe that a particular week would be the crunch week, and the world would finally have clarity regarding when and how the UK would leave the EU. And of particular importance to those here today, we might be able to start analysing opportunities that could arise under a new UK-US free trade agreement. It is, I think, reasonable to conclude that both last week and this week were weeks in which we would finally obtain an outcome. Indeed, Prime Minister Johnson settled somewhat, some would say, unexpectedly, a new deal with the EU, which we'll explain in more detail shortly. But instead, as of this afternoon, focus remains on a number of unresolved questions, the most significant of which are how long will the EU offer an extension to the UK, if they indeed offer an extension, and will there be a UK general election, when will it be, and who will win it? And yet, I think that certain outcomes are becoming more likely, and a particular outcome is becoming more likely, and therefore the question of what a UK-US free trade agreement might look like is becoming less hypothetical. I'm very much looking forward to moderating the discussion today and giving you all something to take away. We've a terrific panel. Ed has already introduced Ambassador Kirk to you. To his right, Congressman Joseph Crowley, a senior policy advisor at Squire Patton Boggs, who represented the people of New York's 14th Congressional District in the US Congress for nearly 20 years. He served in the House Democratic leadership for 6 years, first as vice chair and then as chairman of the caucus. Emila Kasulke, trade policy associate, draws on her experience in both domestic and international policy to assist clients on trade matters. She provides multinational corporations, sovereign governments and entities, and quasi-governmental entities with advice on a wide range of trade policy, legal and regulatory issues. And finally, furthest away from me is Frank Samolis, the co-chair of our international trade practice. He advises clients on international trade matters, including trade law, trade policy and legislation, and international trade negotiations. So I'm going to start by asking Ambassador Kirk, taking no more than 5 minutes, can you please try and give us an overview of Boris's Brexit deal, what the UK government needs to do to get it passed, and how you think that things might pan out over the coming days, weeks and months.
So when I worked in the United Nations, there was a particular nationality who used to start every intervention with the words, "Mr. Chairman, I will be brief." You knew you were in for 45 minutes when that happened. I will try genuinely to be brief. I think the first important thing to say is that the Prime Minister's new Brexit deal, if you take the 550 odd pages of withdrawal agreement that Theresa May negotiated with the European Commission, the overwhelming majority of that is the same. So the treatment of citizens, EU citizens in the UK, UK citizens in the rest of the EU, the financial settlement, a whole host of technical issues about how disputes are settled, all that kind of thing is all the same. Not a word has changed. What has changed is the treatment of Northern Ireland. Those of you who followed Brexit may remember the so-called backstop. This was a way of guaranteeing in a legally binding way that there would be no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Was probably the primary cause, but certainly not the only cause, for the withdrawal agreement failing to get through the House of Commons 3 times under Theresa May's premiership, and indeed bringing about the end of Theresa May's premiership. So Boris, although he was pushed hard by the strongly pro-Brexit faction in the Conservative Party, he decided to focus his renegotiations solely on the issue of Northern Ireland. And the solution they've come up with I can best describe as Schrödinger's province. Northern Ireland remains fully constitutionally and legally part of the United Kingdom, as settled in the Good Friday Agreement, for as long as consent goes in that direction. But for practical purposes, it participates in a number of areas of the single market, obviously the same as the Republic of Ireland, and for practical purposes, critically, within the EU Common Customs Tariff. And this is a different way of bringing about the core objective, which was shared by the UK, by the Government of Ireland, and by the EU, of ensuring no hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and therefore preserving one of the key benefits of the Good Friday Agreement 21 years ago. What happens now, and where does this lead, and where have we got to? I think earlier this week we did have a very important moment amid all the sort of chaos and hoo-ha in the House of Commons. The very important moment was that when the withdrawal agreement bill, the legislation that would implement the bill, went for its second reading, it had quite a comfortable majority in favour of it. This is the first time in the whole Brexit saga that the House of Commons has voted for something which is real, as opposed to it's voted for a number of unicorns, unreal things. But this is the first time it's been presented with a proposition, and it has actually voted for it with, as I say, quite a comfortable majority. And that majority included 19 Labour MPs, 19 opposition MPs. And the significance of that is that it indicates that there is an achievable majority in this House of Commons for the deal that Boris has negotiated. Of course, 15 minutes later, they voted to stop the timetable motion that the Prime Minister had put forward, which would have ensured that the deal was concluded, ratified on the UK side in time for the UK to leave the EU on the 31st of October, the current deadline under the Article 50 process. Now, I think there are a whole range of reasons why that timetable motion failed. In my view, one was that there are quite a large number of MPs who dislike the Prime Minister quite intensely, and since he had nailed his colours firmly to the mast of leaving on the 31st of October, thought that it would actually be quite nice to make him not deliver on that objective. I think there were quite a number of MPs who thought that scrutinising 110 pages of legislation in 2 days was simply not correct. You'd normally expect scrutiny of legislation of that length, complexity and importance to take 6 weeks, 2 months, something like that. And I think there were a number who just object to the deal and think it's a bad deal and therefore wanted to make sure that more opportunity was created to try and derail it. So where does that leave us? The Prime Minister, consistent with a piece of legislation he hates, has applied for an extension to the Article 50 deadline. That's being considered by the EU now. It's a unanimous decision of EU heads of government, and the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, is consulting about what answer the EU will give. The Prime Minister actually wrote 2 letters, a second letter saying he thought extension was a bad idea, corrosive, all the rest of it. I think the EU, rather like President Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you get sent 2 messages, you decide which one you're going to respond to. And the EU, which, in my view, has been determined from the start to ensure that if a sort of disastrous, disruptive Brexit happened, it would not be the EU's fault. I think they have chosen to pick up the tool which the Prime Minister was forced to put in their hands, which means that the EU can avoid being the one that causes a disruptive Brexit to happen by granting an extension. So I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that the EU will refuse an extension. I think there is a debate about how long that extension should be. Short extension would put pressure on Parliament to get the deal agreed. The extension that the legislation caused the Prime Minister to ask for to the end of January would allow time for an election or time for rational scrutiny of the deal and getting it agreed. There is some discussion within the EU about a longer extension through to next summer, which would allow both of those 2 things to happen, but also allow time for another referendum to take place in the UK, were the UK minded to have one. My own view is that last one is very unlikely. It's very unlikely there will be a referendum. There's no majority in Parliament for it at the moment. And while there is quite a strong popular move to try and have a second referendum, there are also a lot of people who were on the Remain side in the referendum who believe that a second referendum would be a dangerous thing for democracy and for the conduct of public life in Britain. So my view is we are entering the final straight. We just don't yet know exactly how long the race is, but the finishing line is sort of coming into view. If the EU opts for a short extension, then I think Parliament will have to meet that. And if it fails to meet it, the risk for the EU, and this was something that was done to the March 29th deadline, the EU opted for a short extension and then had to go for a longer extension straight afterwards. So, that risk is there if the EU wishes to continue to avoid being responsible for a disruptive Brexit. If the EU extension the UK has proposed, that, as I say, allows time both for ratification of the deal and or for an election. And therefore puts the ball firmly back into the Prime Minister's court to decide whether he wants the election, which has to happen because he's successfully taken his majority from +1 to -43, whether he wants that election to happen before Brexit or whether he wants to have Brexit done and then have the election. And that's actually quite a difficult choice for him tactically. But either becomes possible if the EU grants that 3-month extension. If it's a long extension, I think even the January extension, but a long extension, would have a provision within it that if the UK is ready to leave before that, then the leave date will be brought forward. So I don't want to try and make a prediction, and certainly please do not gamble any money on the basis of what I'm about to say, but my expectation is that the UK will have left the EU on the basis of the deal that the Prime Minister has negotiated before the end of January. And then the fun starts. The Prime Minister is telling everyone, let's get Brexit done and then we can move on. What do we move on to? We move on to, I think, around a decade of sorting out what Brexit means. And I'm going to stop at that point.
Thank you very much.
I answered your question, Jeremy.
Well, I was just going to, very, very much so, and I hope everyone was taking notes because there will be a short quiz at the end to check you were listening. I'm going to go to Congressman Crowley now. We'll get on to some of the trade issues a little bit later, but firstly, I'm very interested to know what a US politician makes of what's been going on in the UK over the last 3 or 4 years in relation to Brexit. And in particular, as someone whose ancestors came from the island of Ireland, and someone who's sort of very much committed to and aware of the Good Friday Agreement. I'm interested to know what's your take on British government policy in relation to Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and whether you think that may have an impact on UK-US relations going forward.
5 minutes?
You can have
No,
six.
I'm just teasing. Well, first, it's great to be here and to participate in this, and having just come back from a week in India with Frank Simonis as well as Ambassador Kirk, where I got to hear a great deal about Brexit as a blow-by-blow or play-by-play, as we say here, when everything was playing out. I've also let the ambassador know that we here in the States recognize the confusion and the tumult that is taking place right here in America, and we're very grateful for Britain for distracting us from time to time. So I think the first part of the question was, I know you were talking about what do you make of it, and you know, what advice do you have for us? We were all someone like myself was kind of glued to C-SPAN and watching the proceedings of Parliament throughout all this, and trying to make sense of some of the terminologies that were being used, etc. And at the same time learning about the term impeachment that comes from the British tradition, and learning a good deal about that as well. Fascinated by it, quite frankly. I think recognizing the special relationship between the United States and the UK that does exist and is appreciated in all corners of the United States. And as someone from of Irish roots here, recognizing that as well, and the important relationship that we've sustained, certainly since 1814. And we had a little interlude during the Civil War. But for the most part, it really has been a very important relationship in terms of world order, and that relationship between the UK and the United States. And I think it's appreciated by both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. And so I think we're all a bit unnerved about the level of disruption that's taking place on the island, in the British Isles, and at the same time, the disruption we're seeing here in our own country and around the world and other states as well. So in that sense, really concerned about what this will lead to in terms of the future. And as someone from the Irish American community, someone who has been engaged on the issues pertaining to Ireland, both North and South, and the relationship between Britain, the Irish government, as well as our own government, our own involvement. One of the interesting things is that I think, in many respects, outside of the individuals like Richie Neal, to a degree Nancy Pelosi in the House, Peter King individually, folks in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, and others who have weighed in traditionally over the years on the issue of Ireland, in Northern Ireland in particular, it has been of great concern in terms of those individuals as well, and that's been expressed by Speaker Pelosi when she was in Britain, and Speaker Pelosi when she was in Ireland as well, expressing concern for the Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Accord, respect of it, and that the folks here in the States would not look kindly upon any agreement moving forward with Britain if in some way that were abrogated or dismissed in some sense. And so I think the issue of Northern Ireland is much more complicated, and the Brexit issue only further complicates it in terms of the border itself. But knowing that the McGuinness principles are issues of concern, lack of a written Bill of Rights, respect for the Irish language itself in the North, amongst other issues that are percolating, and that's from the nationalist side. And then dealing with the unionist side as well in terms of their needs and their desires as well. And I think that's what the Good Friday Accord actually met, was they met the needs of both unionists and nationalists, in that you can be a unionist and feel a part of Great Britain. And as Matthew has expressed, I think very eloquently, at least certainly to me, and being Irish in the north of Ireland and feeling a part of, in some respects, the whole island of Ireland, and that identity as well, which was an incredible accomplishment, 21 years ago, with more to come and more to be decided. So that's where kind of how we look at it.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I feel at this stage, given that we are honoured to have His Excellency Ambassador Daniel Mulhall, the Ambassador from Ireland to the US with us today, not to now go to him for any reflections on what either Ambassador Kirk or Congressman Crowley has just said in terms of Brexit and specifically in relation to the Irish border question.
Well, thank you very much. I was the Ambassador for Ireland in London for 4 years between 2013 and 2017, so I lived through the Brexit nightmare, if you like. And it is a nightmare for Ireland because we've had a very good relationship with the UK over the last 45 years as fellow members of the European Union. It's helped to smooth out some of the rough edges of the relationship between Britain and Ireland. When I was there, things really came to a very positive peak of mutual respect when our President paid the first ever state visit to the UK, which followed on from a previous visit by Queen Elizabeth II to Ireland. And everything was really hunky-dory until the Brexit business came in to sort of stir things up. And it has stirred things up very badly from an Irish point of view. And we have two concerns. First of all, we have the concern about our economic relationship. Well, first of all, apart from that, we will miss the UK around the table in Brussels because they tended to be on the same side as Ireland when it comes to being in favour of free trade, smart regulation, not too much oversight on the part of the Commission. There's always a bit of pulling and hauling goes on in Brussels between the member states about the direction of European policy. And in general, we were on the same side as the British on many of those issues, and we will miss their influence around the table. Secondly, we're worried about the impact of Brexit on Irish-British trade, because even though today only about 15% or less of our exports go to the UK, for some Irish-owned companies, particularly food companies and agricultural, rural-based companies, the exports that go to the UK are vitally important to them. Maybe 40% or even half of their overall sales go to the UK. So that relationship, we don't want to see that relationship damaged in any way, because it would be economically damaging for the Irish economy, and particularly for rural Ireland, which of course we would be very sorry if the benefits of Brexit in Ireland were to go to the cities where maybe more investment from the US may come in because of US companies wanting a base within the European Union. They will tend to come to Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, Waterford, the big cities, and the losses will be in rural areas and small companies that maybe find barriers to their sales to the UK because of tariffs and controls and so forth. And then secondly, we've been worried about the border, because it's been an open border for the last 25 years, because the conflict came to an end. At the same time, the single market opened up and border controls became irrelevant either for economic or for security purposes. If you suddenly bring back border controls for economic reasons to do with the customs union and so forth, then you have changed, as far as a lot of people in Northern Ireland are concerned, you have turned the clock back. And the danger of doing that is that that could lead to a downward spiral back towards violence. And that's why for the last 2.5 years we've been insisting there cannot be a border on the island of Ireland. The agreement that was reached last week in Brussels is satisfactory from an Irish point of view. We'd prefer if Britain decided to stay, but we recognise that's not really in our gift. What we insist on is that there can be no border on the island of Ireland. And this agreement between the UK and the EU would avoid border controls on the island of Ireland. What would happen in the Irish Sea, in my view, will be very limited and shouldn't be a problem for anybody, because it would be invisible. It would simply be checks to make sure that no company in Britain is abusing the open border in Ireland in order to get around a European Union single market controls. We have to protect the single market, and that's why we're concerned that nothing should happen that would undermine the single market, because that would be damaging from an Irish point of view. We earnestly hope that this agreement will go through the Parliament. It may not be ideal, but at least it's an agreement that it seems there's a majority in Parliament for. I agree with Ambassador Kirk that this is an important moment, and I hope that the British government will capitalise on that and move on to actually leave the EU in a sensible way, in a pragmatic, in a smooth process, rather than jumping off the cliff, which is what a no-deal Brexit would have entailed. I also agree with Ambassador Kirk that this is not the end of the story by any means. This is, what was it Churchill said, the end of the beginning, or something like that. Some phrase of Churchill's could apply in this case. I'm sure Prime Minister Johnson is a great fan of Churchill's, will be aware of that. But yes, the future negotiations about the relationship between the UK and the EU going forward for the years and decades ahead, that's going to be quite a vexed negotiation. It's going to be quite difficult. It's going to be quite contentious. And a lot of the same issues are going to arise again. And therefore, the Brexit issue is probably going to last for many years to come. Our earnest hope, and what I've been saying in America is the following. And I've had very good hearing from people in Congress, from the administration also, but also in particular from Irish American audiences. I was in Philadelphia 2 weeks ago. A huge crowd turned up to hear me speak about Brexit there. I was in Scranton, Pennsylvania. An even bigger crowd turned up. And my message is the same all the time. We're not looking for Americans or Irish Americans to take sides on Brexit. We want to see the UK and the US do a good trade deal, because that benefits us. Because we want to see the UK prosper. Because the more the UK prospers, the better it is for us as our nearest neighbour. They're always going to be important economic partners for us. I also make the point that from a US point of view, it is silly for anybody in the US to think that Brexit's a good idea for the United States. Because nobody I know has ever argued to me, no sensible economist has ever said that Brexit would produce an economic dividend. It's going to be an economic hit for the UK and the European Union, and therefore for the United States, which is so closely connected with the European Union and the UK in terms of trade and investment flows. So all I'm saying to people here is beware of the fact that Brexit is not good for the United States, and it's certainly the harder, more destructive forms of Brexit would be very bad for a peace process that Americans like Joe Crowley and many, many others besides him have spent so much time to bring into being. We're saying, you may think Brexit's a good idea, or you may not. That's your own business. But please remember the implications of Brexit for the border in Ireland and for the precious peace process that, with American help, has saved thousands of lives over the last 21 years. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I was just thinking, I don't think I've been on the other side of one of these talks when I've had Brexit explained to me by a serving Irish ambassador, a former British ambassador, and a former US congressman. So it's been certainly fascinating for me, and I hope for you. But now I do want to go from where we are now to look to the future and to talk a little bit about trade policy. So I'm going to go to Frank now. Frank, interested to hear your views on the current state of President Trump's trade policy and his direction of travel. And I want to broaden out not just to look at it in the context of a possible US-UK FTA, but also a US-EU FTA, because, and tell me if I've got this right, I don't think that you can see the two of those in isolation.
Right.
So, Frank.
Right, thank you. What I'd like to do is to put the Brexit debate in the context of U.S. trade policy, because if it's not complicated enough now with Brexit, we have a U.S. trade policy which is very difficult to comprehend, particularly in light of some very recent developments. I might remind you at the beginning, on the campaign trail before President Trump was elected, on trade, he said the first thing he will do as president is negotiate a free trade agreement with the United Kingdom. Which legally he couldn't do at that point, but leave it aside, it underscores his feeling toward the UK and the fact that there should be strong economic relationships. Where we are now in light of developments, and I would say developments recently within the last month, it's showing us a little bit of a splintered trade policy. The word now is mini trade deals. We have these mini agreements, and I'll explain why the president has taken that strategy in a minute, which are causing some people to think about what is the effect on a possible U.S.-UK free trade agreement? Let's start with China. You recall, everybody knows about the China wars, where we are, the escalating tariffs, and the fact that recently the president announced that he was happy to say that he's reached phase 1 of what I think he terms a phase 4 agreement with China. We don't know a lot of the details, and that's part of the frustration. Phase 1, according to the president's tweets, the Chinese have agreed to purchase, this is just one example, $30 to $40 billion of additional agricultural exports from the U.S. The Chinese response was, well, that's not exactly what we said. Our purchases will have to reflect market conditions and a number of other things that cast some doubt as to what exactly was agreed to. I can go down the line on intellectual property and on tech transfer, but the point is the president now has a tendency to announce an end result without providing a lot of details. So the phase 1 is still a big mystery, and now we have phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. I fear that at the end of phase 4, we may be, after all of this China trade war, back to where we started. The tariffs will be lifted. The Chinese may agree to purchase some additional products, not a whole lot. And why did we go through this for the past several years other than to impose a huge cost on the American consumer? That's China. Then you may recall that the president announced a trade agreement with Japan. This was on the margins of the UNGA, United Nations General Assembly. Once again, we have a mini deal with China. This is phase 1 of a trade agreement with China, which is limited in its scope, and the details of which we know some, but we don't know everything. So once again, the president announced an agreement with the details still to be forthcoming. So that's mini deal number 2. Mini deal number 3 is India. We have a trade agreement that was rumored to be in the offing, again on the margins of UNGA. It was rumored to be possibly announced when Modi went to Houston for Howdy Modi event. It was a big 50,000 Indian Americans. The president announced a trade agreement, but he didn't explain what the details are. So we are seeing a pattern here, and this is very recent, of the president getting ahead of himself a little bit by announcing an end result without giving us the details of what exactly was agreed to. This pattern concerns me because it reflects the fact that there may be a lot to be worked out in the details after the president gets over his tweet saying we've got yet another trade agreement. So those are 3 mini agreements. They're limited agreements. I think there's a certain logic to this, and the logic is that none of these mini agreements are free trade agreements, and that's an important legal distinction. Free trade agreements are legally not treaties in the United States. They are not self-executing. They have to be, as a congressman knows, approved by Congress under something called we used to call it fast-track process. Because a trade agreement is not a treaty, the U.S. Congress has to actually vote to implement that agreement into U.S. law. We have a unique constitutional procedure set up to approve those agreements, and that is where we are now with respect to the new NAFTA agreement, the USMCA. As Congressman Carley knows full well, that agreement is pending before the Congress. And this is an important break in terms of the Trump trade policy, because everything he has done to date, the 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, all of these mini agreements I mentioned, the China trade wars, all of those were done on a unilateral basis without consulting with Congress and without the need to get congressional approval. The USMCA approval is the first time, whether he likes it or not, that the president has to go to the Congress, including the Democratic House, to seek the votes. And this has been an ongoing debate. We are now starting to get very worried that we may not have enough time this year to get an approval for USMCA. But I mention that because I think that's a motivation for having these smaller agreements with China, with India, with Japan, because the president realizes if he does this, he doesn't have to deal with Congress, which I think is not particularly to his liking. He doesn't like to deal with Congress on those issues. So that's where we are with respect to the mini agreements and the the free trade agreement. We now have looming a very important decision which could radically alter trade negotiations between the U.S. and Europe and the U.S. and the U.K., and that is the ongoing 232 investigation on automobiles and auto parts. Just to give you a quick recap of where we are, that investigation has been completed. The recommendation has gone to the President. It was due to be announced on May 17th. The President said, I'm going to give my trade negotiators an additional 6 months to come up with agreements that may forestall the need to impose additional tariffs on auto and auto parts. We are now at the point where something very major may happen with respect to the auto tariffs. We think that Japan may have covered this under its bilateral agreement, which means the bulk of the impact of whatever is decided would fall on Europe. And that is the biggest issue facing the U.S.-EU trade negotiations. Remember, the President notified Congress he intends to negotiate an agreement. The biggest issue by far for the European Union is how are we going to be affected by a 232 agreement on autos and auto parts. Until that's resolved, it's going to have a huge cloud over U.S. Europe and the U.S. and the U.K. So that brings us then to where we are right now in terms of the negotiations. I think Mr. Trump has used his leverage as much as he can to try and secure an agreement, but the problem is that there is a tremendous uncertainty as what the end result will be. Nobody knows what this China agreement will end up in. Nobody knows what the India agreement will actually say. And now on top of that, we have a USMCA that has to be approved. So putting all that in context, I think it should help understand how Brexit and a potential free trade agreement with Europe and the UK will be treated in light of these political and economic developments.
Frank, thank you very much. Mill, I want to take as Frank just ended by bringing that global review back to a UK-US FTA. And I want to ask you, what do you think the Trump administration's preferred Brexit deal would look like? What would be the scope and the content of a quickly concluded, mutually beneficial UK-US FTA?
Yes, I think overall, I think all of us who do trade policy follow the president's Twitter feed very closely. And I think on Twitter especially, he's been very pro-Brexit. It represents for him a lot of the same populist and anti-establishment principles that brought him into office. But at the same time, it rejects the multilateralism of the EU, and for the president and for many of the people that closely advise him, multilateralism is a threat to sovereignty. And so really broadly, that's how he and his advisors are looking at it. But at the same time, they see it as an opportunity to bring the UK closer to the US's principles and norms and push it away from the EU's. As Frank noted, I mean, the US-UK agreement has been a huge priority for the president since the campaign trail. But everything has sort of been formally on hold, obviously, as many as you know, for the formal Brexit to occur. But as you know, the two sides did launch a working group in July 2017 to sort of start to lay the groundwork for the talks. In October 2018, we had a big step forward in that the Trump administration notified Congress of its intent to negotiate the US-UK trade agreement. That is, as Frank mentioned, part of Trade Promotion Authority, part of this fast-track process, and it lays the groundwork for the Trump administration to seek congressional approval and benefit from those fast-track procedures in the future. Following public comments, including a hearing, the administration released detailed summary of its negotiating objectives that formally set out what the U.S. would seek as part of a deal, also a requirement from TPA. And what's really interesting in preparing for the remarks today, I pulled up the UK negotiating objectives that were released and the same ones that the US released for the US-EU talks, which were released a few weeks apart, and they are very closely aligned. So these general principles, for the most part, with the exception of intellectual property, where there's actually much more detail in what the US would seek in its talks with the UK, there's actually a lot of similarities in what the two sides are going to try, what the United States is going to try to achieve as part of these talks. Overall, though, nothing is going to happen formally until we pass Brexit. And what's to keep in mind, what does the U.S. want to see? The starker the split between the UK and the EU, the easier it will be for the U.S. to negotiate what it wants bilaterally. Overall, the administration likes to negotiate bilaterally. So when we talk about what the terms and the scope of a possible trade agreement could look like, overall, the Trump administration is going to be pushing for a balanced deal, what it perceives as a balanced deal. It's going to want to make sure that the two sides of the ledger are at least equal, if not more so benefiting U.S. Businesses and stakeholders. Overall, I do believe the U.S. will think it has the upper hand in this situation. And it's going to push for increased purchases of U.S. goods. I mean, that has been part of every negotiation so far, especially in the ag sector, is a commitment to buy more agricultural products from the U.S. I think the U.S. is going to expect that everything remains on the table, that no topics are off limits. For example, I think principles that impact drug pricing are very controversial, but that is something that will probably be a part of those discussions. And I think overall, when we're talking modern trade agreements, provisions on e-commerce are super critical, and looking towards what was negotiated in the USMCA will probably give you a very good idea of what the U.S. is going to seek and what they would see as sort of the gold standard.
Thank you, Mila. Congressman, as a former chairman of the Democratic Caucus, what do you think would be the issues that they would be concerned about?
Well, I think you see them playing out right now in the USMCA debate. The task force that was put together by Speaker Pelosi to negotiate with Ambassador Lighthizer on the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, really zeroing in on labor. And that may not be as contentious, obviously, with a developed state like the UK or the EU. But I think the environment certainly will be something that Democrats would be demanding of. And quite frankly, I think the European Union, as well as the UK in all likelihood, will be as demanding that environmental provisions be put into any agreement with the United States going forward. So it won't just be Democrats, but it'll be something that I think that is reflective in the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, is a full chapter on the environment itself for the first time in any agreement that the U.S. has entered into. Maybe reflective of recognition going forward that will have to be the case, and then even more enhanced than maybe that presently agreed to in this agreement. I think, so just generally speaking, the issue of intellectual property is also something of debate here in the Congress right now amongst Democrats as well, as it applies over a myriad of issues, music, in film, in tech, in pharma, across the board. Those issues are being very keenly debated within the Democratic caucus and certainly between the working group and Ambassador Lighthizer. As it comes to the issue of a free trade agreement with Britain, and the question really is the cart before the horse or the chicken before the egg, et cetera, would Britain be looking to enter into an agreement with the EU first? From my end of it, and that may be a smarter way about going about this, and would actually affect I think it's a 4-year provision, Matthew, where for the approval of the Northern Irish end of it.
4 years after it.
And that, in terms of smoothing a border or diminishing that, if somehow the UK were able to enter into an agreement with the EU more reflective of what exists today in terms of a free trade agreement, that would further diminish possibly some of the tension that would exist on the island of Ireland. But beyond that, one other issue in terms of the UK that I mentioned earlier, that Speaker Pelosi has made very clear, again, that when it comes to this particular issue, the investment of the states in the peace process in Ireland was substantial. it has been diminished, quite frankly. I think the president has indicated his desire to enter into an agreement with the UK, saying things will be fine, sending the vice president over to reiterate that, maybe as a bargaining tool for the prime minister. But in the end, the EU itself has replaced the United States in many respects as the arbiter of fairness, for lack of a better term, not only because of concern of an actual the need for a border for the EU itself, but also not wanting to see the island of Ireland revert back to the troubles of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And I think that's important to recognize as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Can I, sorry, Jeremy,
Yes, of course.
just wanted to comment quickly on two things that Congressman Crowley said. First of all, the environment. The UK has become the first major economy in the world to commit itself to a net zero carbon neutral economy. And my expectation is that other European countries will follow that path relatively quickly. The adaptation of the economy to enable that to happen is huge. The adaptation of industry to enable that to happen is huge. And I think this will be a much, much harder factor in FTA negotiations in the future than it has been up to now, because I do not think that UK industry, European industry, will accept competition from industries who are not having to make the same kinds of adaptation. And this is something President Macron has been very strong about, that the environmental provisions of free trade agreements going forward must absolutely reflect that carbon zero ambition. And I think my sense when I come to the US and I talk about trade issues in the US is that dimension is a little underplayed in the US understanding of where both the EU and the UK will come from. The second comment on a very important point, and also picking up on what the ambassador said about the arrangements between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, the famous line down the Irish Sea, and the ambition that the ambassador outlined of something that is really almost invisible is clearly what everyone would like to see. And that's greatly facilitated if you have a tariff-free free trade agreement between the UK and the EU. It's also greatly facilitated if you have a relatively high degree of regulatory alignment between the UK and the EU. Now, one of the changes that happened in the negotiation of the New Deal is that the so-called level playing field provisions between the UK and the EU were removed from the legally binding part of the agreement and watered down somewhat and put into the political declaration about the future relationship. And I think there are some in the British Conservative Party who do see quite a radical deregulated future for the UK as a way of stimulating an economic advantage. Were the UK to go down that route, the EU has already been clear, and I think this would be a very difficult part of the negotiations, that it would be much harder to achieve the kind of very broad, very comprehensive tariff-free free trade agreement that both the EU and the UK have talked about in the past. And on top of that, the kind of arrangements across the Irish Sea that the ambassador outlined become not impossible to achieve, but that much harder to achieve. You just make it that much more difficult. So my prediction is, and I think this is again an important thing to understand at this end of the telescope, as it were, the UK more or less has to do its free trade agreement with the EU first. That doesn't mean that negotiations with the US can't be going on at the same time, and indeed they could conclude more or less simultaneously, but the primary one has to be with the EU. Why? First of all, the EU is by far the UK's largest trading partner, and sorting out your relationship with your largest trading partner in the position of Brexit would seem to be sensible. But secondly, and crucially importantly, is that the way in which the arrangements over Northern Ireland will play out in practice and the degree to which they become a problem in British politics in the future does depend critically on the level of the degree of alignment that the UK has with the EU, both on tariffs and on regulatory standards. Now, that means that if you're sitting here in the US and thinking about what you want to see in a US-UK FTA, you need to think about what goes into the UK-EU FTA as well. You cannot think of these as two separate processes. They are linked processes. And indeed, I would say there will be a link with the other side of the triangle, the EU-US FTA as well. And I think that understanding of the triangular nature of this very complex set of FTAs is critical to understanding how you need to play your interests in to how they operate.
Frank.
If I could just add to what Ambassador Kirk just said, I think there's less of a sensitivity to the climate change issue in the U.S., certainly when compared to the U.K. or the EU. But there certainly is a recognition that there is a linkage between the environment and free trade agreements. And this goes back over 25 years to the original NAFTA agreement. And you remember George Bush negotiated the NAFTA agreement. Bill Clinton then won the election. His position in the campaign trail was, I support NAFTA, but I could come up with a better agreement. The better agreement that he came up with were two side agreements, one involving labor issues and the other the environment. And ever since NAFTA, broadly speaking, the Democratic Party has always insisted on environmental provisions in any free trade agreement. So the linkage to include something involving climate change is not a radical idea, certainly from the perspective of Democratic policymakers when it comes to free trade agreements.
The only point I was making, though, Frank, was that for the first time it's actually in a chapter itself in the agreement and not a side agreement in the USMCA. I should also point out, for full disclosure, I'm co-chairing the past USMCA coalition, so it's on the front end of that.
Did you want to add anything, Miller? Or
Oh, no.
not on that point. Well, now might be a good opportunity to see if anyone on the floor has any questions. I've got a few more for the panel, but I thought we would just pause to see if there were any questions.
I'm Jeremy Corbyn with the Brexit Corporation. We actually have operations in London as well as obviously Brexit is of great concern to us. And part of what I'm hearing today is a lot of this is a backlash to globalization, that now you're seeing, basically we're fighting about trade, and of course once you aren't trading, you're fighting. But I really actually want to have a question really directed at Ambassador Kirk. I guess I had been sort of thinking about this as being kind of a UK-centric issue, but you were discussing how the EU is actually approaching the UK right now. And it sort of struck me when you said that it's like who gets the blame at the end. What are the factions or what are the pressures that are going on within the EU that may be causing the difficulties, or is this really more of a UK-Irish issue? I just hadn't thought about it from the EU perspective.
So it's an extremely good question and quite a hard one to answer. I think, as the ambassador said earlier on, from the EU's point of view, Brexit is a disruptive thing that is unwelcome. But at the same time, the EU has been very clear from the start that the EU is founded on principles of democracy. The UK has taken a decision, and the EU respects that decision. I think that so you sort of start from that position, that from the EU's perspective, this is managing, respecting a democratically taken decision and managing an unwelcome process to the least damaging outcome that you can achieve. I think the other thing to say, which when I talk to friends who work in governments around the EU, is that there's been a huge focus, inevitably, on the economics of Brexit, one way or another, and what the economic impact will be on both the EU, individual EU member states, and on the UK. But the relationship between the UK and the EU is an awful lot broader than that. And the UK, represents roughly a sixth of the European economy. It represents rather more than that in terms of proportion of strategic capability, defence, intelligence, all of that kind of area. The relationships within the EU, including the UK at the moment, in terms of domestic security, fighting terrorism, fighting organised crime, all of these things have developed to an incredible level of sophistication, which has undoubtedly done a great deal to keep people safe in the streets of all European cities. And I think that as we move beyond the separation phase, working out how the EU is a rules-based organization, and for the EU to be able to do something, there has to be something in the European treaties that enables it to happen. And the UK will create a number of challenges for that going forward, because the UK will become a third party. A third party like Uzbekistan is a third party to the EU. Obviously a little bit closer, a little bit bigger, you'd hope, sharing many values that the EU shares. And working out how you recreate, particularly in these areas of security, strategy, policy, things like the EU has a wonderful program enabling students to travel and engage in university life in universities in other EU countries. If you look at the list of the top universities in the world, there are a number of universities, EU universities there. The top EU universities currently in that list are all in the UK. The demand to come to UK universities is very high. So preserving these programs, which are of enormous importance culturally, and preserving the security cooperation, that kind of thing, I think is going to be a really hard thing to do, because where on the economy you can say there are swings and roundabouts, an economic activity will move from here to there, a chance of innovation will happen here which wouldn't have happened otherwise. On the security and cultural side, if we don't collectively find a good way forward, everybody loses. And on the security side in particular, everybody losing could mean people dying. And I think that, in some ways, when I talk to people in Brussels, that's the bit that bothers them most. And that has really hardly, how you sort that out has hardly started yet. I absolutely share what the ambassador said about the importance of a smooth Brexit. I think, having a disruptive Brexit, not only for the immediate economic damage it would do, it's quite clearly, sort of, if you're going to take aim with a double-barreled gun and at both feet, it has about that effect on your ability to keep standing. But it would also, because of that disruption, I think cause a much more toxic atmosphere about what the future relationship should be, which would make these security, cultural, scientific relationships much harder to sustain politically on both sides of the channel. And I think, it's been quite striking to me how successive strongly pro-Brexit ministers or strongly pro-Brexit politicians have come into the British government, and as they have started to look at the implications of some of the ranges of things that could happen under Brexit, their rhetoric has stayed the same, but their actions have moved towards a much more moderate approach to how you do it. It's a complicated way of answering your question, but it is a very complicated thing. And I do think it'll take us quite a long time to work out what the future relationship will look like, what its shape should be. My hope is that it will be possible to enable a degree of separation in how you address the economic issues, where clearly, as Chancellor Merkel said the other day, the UK becomes a competitor to the EU, and it's perfectly natural the EU would treat the UK as a competitor in that sense. A competitor, but also quite an important economic partner. So, I mean, it's not a sort of US-China type competitor relationship, more a US-Canada-Mexico type competitor relationship. To separate that in the optics and the politics and so forth from how you address the issues where everyone loses if you get it wrong. My final comment is within the sort of range of people who have promoted Brexit and voted Brexit and so forth, you've got an extraordinary diversity of political approach. From what you would describe as a little Englander approach, and they are all in England, not in Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, who really want to go back to the paradise world of the 1950s when everything was wonderful and you never saw a foreigner and it was all a marvelous life. Two people who are extraordinarily internationalist in their approach, and many of them very, very pro-European. They just don't like the EU as an institution and a bureaucracy. And Boris Johnson's Prime Minister is definitely one of those. His heritage is entirely European. He speaks a number of European languages. He loves Europe. He just doesn't like the European Union. And I think that's a distinction which I've spent a great deal of I was educated in and have spent a lot of my diplomatic career in France. And if you listen to how the French talk, there is a complete synonymity between Europe and the European Union. And I think there's a distinction there that the Brexit, the internationalist pro-European Brexiteers have drawn out. They would say, they would argue, and believe, and I think demonstrate in what they do, that there will be no difference in values between the UK in the future and the EU in the future. And we need to articulate how we jointly defend those values internationally. I would say, as Frank said, and the Congressman, we've spent the last 10 days in India. And it was a question that came up from the Indians looking towards the US and towards the UK and towards Europe. What are we looking at? And a point we made to the Indian friends we were talking to was there is also a sort of community of democracies which stretches roughly from the US and Canada down across Europe to India and then on to Australia and New Zealand. And there's something that unites democracies as well. And again, when we're looking with so much open about global governance and the rules-based international system and all the rest of it, not losing sight of the importance of that democratic link is very important to me.
Thank you. Hope that answered your question. Any others from the floor? You? Just over here.
There can be no doubt that the decision of Britain to withdraw from the EU did real damage to the European project, that thousands of employees of the European Commission view it as a disappointment, if not an affront. They've spent their entire working lives striving to build an ever stronger union. Before the referendum, you heard grumblings among European countries that were flirting with the notion about perhaps also leaving the Union. You don't hear that anymore, in part because these countries see just what a mess it has been in Britain and just how high a price Britain might pay. Both of which lead, I think, many in Brussels to think that it is in the EU's best interest to assure that, in fact, Britain does pay a high price for leaving the EU. And my question is whether that might complicate the negotiation of a UK-EU free trade agreement. For example, the EU has very generous trade agreements with a variety of countries that border the European Union. They create the European Economic Area. You might think those could become a template for a UK-EU free trade agreement, but might there be a counter tendency among those in Brussels to think we need to be tough to demonstrate to other members that leaving the EU is not a good idea?
Can I, between colleagues, the ambassador might want to comment on this. I think you may have been reading elements of the British press too much. I've been working within in relation to the EU for 35 years. I think the way the EU has set about this negotiation has been obviously acting in the EU's interests. What would you expect? But it's been very fair. Right at the beginning of the process, Mr. Barnier put a slide, it's on the EU website, you can find it, saying there are 6 different ways in which you can do Brexit. You choose, your choice, from the EU's point of view, any one of these works. The problem has come about because the UK decided that it wanted none of the 6, but something rather different, and couldn't actually decide exactly what it wanted. And in a sense, the Commission's position hasn't changed at all from the beginning. Some friends of mine in the Commission early on, you heard a little chuntering about we must make this painful, but I've never thought that was happening. I think there is a psychological difference between, and I've certainly experienced this myself, between people who are within the heart of the European project in Brussels, who do find Brexit an affront. I don't think that means they want to punish the UK. I think they're very puzzled by it, and member states were, broadly speaking, the attitude I've encountered is, we think you're mad, but if you're going to do it, fine. Let's work out how we make it work. So I really don't think that the EU is setting out to punish the UK. What I do think is true, interestingly, Chancellor Merkel said this to Boris Johnson a couple of weeks ago on a phone call that was then leaked in a rather extraordinary way by someone in Number 10 who wasn't even listening into it. I do think it is true that because of Northern Ireland, because of the Good Friday Agreement, it's actually harder for the UK to leave the EU than it is for any other country other than the Republic of Ireland, were the Republic to decide to leave without the UK. There is no other situation in Europe like Northern Ireland, and as the ambassador said earlier, everyone involved, Commission, the government of the Republic, the government of the UK, the parties in Northern Ireland, everyone has been determined that whatever the outcome of Brexit is should not disturb what we've achieved through the Good Friday Agreement. And that is what has made it so hard. And if you remove that element from it, I think it would have been a relatively smooth process. Ambassador?
Yes, we'll hand to the ambassador to respond.
Yeah, thank you. It's very timely because I have to leave now. I've got another event in about a half an hour's time. But just to say, first of all, in relation to the question there, I think most people in Ireland have been highly impressed by the solidarity that we've received from our European partners, and as a result of that, support for EU membership in Ireland has gone up dramatically. It was always very high, but it's gone up now to over 90% support for EU membership, which is an extraordinary figure in any democratic environment. So, and it has been because, basically EU countries have been determined to demonstrate that EU membership means something. Because if it doesn't, then why would anyone want to be a member of the European Union? So that has been a feature of these negotiations. In terms of the question about punishment, I've certainly heard people express that view. We should make an example of them. But very quickly, you get a response, as you mentioned, from member states. Like, for example, Ireland. You might say, well, we would be the ones that might be thinking along those lines. But no. Because my attitude to that is, and I've said this publicly in Ireland at the very beginning, if Britain were to be damaged economically, the damage would then come back and hit us. So in other words, the self-interest of EU member states require preferably that Britain should remain closely aligned economically with the European Union, because anything else is damaging for the UK and therefore damaging for the European Union. So the negotiation that will take place in the coming years will be one where the UK may have a desire to strike out in all sorts of radically different ways, but that will come up against the reality that the further they move away from European Union standards and tariff structures, the more difficult it will be for them to have the kind of close economic relationship with the European Union that's in their best interest. And I never met anybody in Britain who was sensible, who was aware, a Confederation of British Industry, the Bank of England, all the major commentators recognise that at best leaving the EU will be damaging. The question about how big the damage will be, that's a debate that people have and there are different views, but nobody thinks it's a good thing. And therefore, nobody, in my experience, in the European Union wants to do anything other than protect, than illustrate, make the point that if you're a member of a club, which is the European Union, which has all these advantages, you cannot leave the club, bear none of the responsibilities of membership that everyone else has to bear, like, for example, contributing to the budget and obeying the rules and so on, and still have all the benefits of EU membership. So it's a question of striking a balance between what responsibilities Britain is willing to take on the one hand, and what advantages it wants to continue to have from its relationship with the European Union. And that balance has to be struck over the next year. And it's going to be a very difficult balance to strike, given that Britain is essentially divided right down the middle about, first of all, whether it's a good idea at all to leave the European Union or whether they should remain, and also on the kind of Britain that they want to create outside the European Union. Do they want to create a Britain that's very similar to the Britain that exists today, but just has a different relationship with the EU? Or do they want a radically different Britain? But that is not something that the EU member states or the Commission are going to decide. That's for a decision in Britain. And it will be a subject of very heated debate in Britain over the next couple of years. And it's one that we hope they come up with a sensible vision of how they want Britain to relate to their nearest neighbours. We're hoping for it, but you never know. Anyway, I've really got to go, but thank you very much for listening to me here. And I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time. And I agree 100% with the ambassador here, who can represent me from now on. And also my deputy is here in case there are any Irish questions that have to be answered afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Can I just add very quickly, and then I'll hand over one other point about the UK-EU FTA negotiations. These are going to be completely unique FTA negotiations in the history of free trade negotiations, because it's the first time ever that two units, the EU and the UK, which are completely aligned in every single respect, are going to negotiate about divergence. FTA negotiations are normally about how you converge from different positions. Nobody's ever done one of these before. I mean, I think as a sort of student of these things, it's going to be fascinating. But that in itself also makes it more difficult, because, and very much as the ambassador said, if you start from a position of complete convergence and it's working well for your economy, actually, why would you diverge? And I've been quite struck that the UK government explaining the deal has explained the change that I described in the way the agreement operates on a level playing field and so forth as giving the UK more flexibility. The moment you say to them, well, where do you want to exercise this flexibility? Actually, they don't really have an answer. And so I think that is an area of UK policy making that's going to need to be teased out.
I would just add one point in the observation, both from the ambassador's position as well as the ambassador's position, and that is the complexities of the agreements. I was around Congress for 20 years. I voted for many agreements. I voted against other agreements, trade agreements. I have yet to see a slam dunk trade agreement. And anyone is under the mindset that don't worry, the United States is prepared to enter into agreement with you, Great Britain, when you leave the EU, and it'll happen immediately. Is just it's fairyland. It is unicorn. It is not going to happen. I'm not saying it won't happen. As I said before, I think there is the special relationship between the States and UK, and between the States and the EU. It does exist, and especially the UK. But it will not be an easy negotiation or a very quick negotiation as well. And I did want to make one other point. The only entities that probably will benefit from this is a global practice that has a trade a trade group working within it. So for Squire Patton Boggs, I think we're on a very good spot in terms of being very happy about these future negotiations.
Thank you, Congressman. Frank.
Let me just add one remark, which is all the discussion we've had this evening, we really shouldn't be here. We really shouldn't be talking about bilateral free trade agreements. People forget that what we're supposed to be doing is negotiating on a multilateral basis. We have something called the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And it's unfortunate that for a variety of reasons, the WTO collapsed as a meaningful forum for reaching multilateral trade agreements. Trade continues, barriers continue, so countries do the next best thing, which is to negotiate a bilateral or regional trade agreement. But I worry that for the long term, the institutional strength of the WTO is under challenge. And unfortunately, the current administration in the U.S. is not in support of multilateral institutions. They're not in support of a multilateral body that will rule on global trade disputes. But in the long term, the answer is what the EU and Japan have been doing, is to come up with a program for reform in the WTO, because in the long term, that is where we're going to address the really tough issues. China's structural impediments, state-owned enterprises, all of those things can be addressed. But the answer is not to continue with a flurry of bilateral trade agreements. Ideally, and this is a little bit idealistic, we should be going back to the WTO, reform it, make it stronger as an institution, and to pursue a multilateral approach.
Thank you. Now, there's a gentleman who's been waiting very patiently there to ask his question. So I'm going to ask, if you can ask that question, if we can try and keep answers brief, and then I'm just going to throw my final question that I haven't told the panel about, and then we will break for drinks. So,
thank you. Austin Harrison, also with Squire Patton Boggs, but this is actually in line with Congressman Crowley, where you were talking about this idea that the U.S. and the UK could enter an agreement quickly. That was going to be my part one of the question is, in an ideal scenario, how quick would that occur from the UK's perspective? And part two to that is, how will the U.S. 2020 elections impact these negotiations?
Well, I'll leave the Congressman to answer the second half of that. So on the first half, I think you get very different answers from different bits of British politics. So some would say it's going to be a fantastic FTA, it can be done incredibly quickly, it's going to be wonderful and brilliant.
Best ever.
Best ever, yeah, until next week's. Others would say, well, if it's going to lead to the UK being covered in chlorinated chicken and American big pharma buying the National Health Service and that kind of thing, then frankly the negotiations could take 30 years as far as we're concerned. So there are some real hard political issues in the thing. The other thing I was amused when Miller was talking at the beginning about the US objectives in this, greater balance in the trade. Well, actually, the UK would greatly welcome that, because the US has a substantial trade surplus with the UK. So, greater balance would mean more UK goods coming to the US and less US goods coming to the UK. So I'm not, I think things like that arguably make it easier, because there isn't a substantial, from the US's point of view, a substantial trade balance to correct. But I do think on climate, on agri-foods, and on access to public services, there are some really, really hard things to negotiate, and that will take time and will bump up against hard politics on both sides of the Atlantic. But maybe the 2020 elections will rescue us, Joe.
Well, I think the 2020 elections make it even more difficult to get anything done next year. Certainly prior to the elections, if you're looking at a lame duck, certainly that anything can happen at that point. But you already see, Frank Simolis had mentioned, we're running up against the clock right now in terms of passing the USMCA this year. What he's really referencing is that if we don't do it within the next 21 legislative days that are left here in this calendar year, you are fully into now the presidential election year. It's already started. It started months ago, certainly within the Democratic caucus. And we have a lot of other distractions here in Washington as well going on for this White House. It's not to say that they can't negotiate that or move forward on it. I'm not saying they're not going to make attempts to do that as well. But the further we get into the election year, the more difficult it is to do anything that is not a must-do. And even some of the must-dos are more difficult to do right now than they ought to be.
Great. Well, I have the final questions for the panel, two-part question. This day in 3 years' time, that's the first part, 3 years' time, is there a UK-US FTA in force? And if the answer to that is no, when do you think there will be one? Let's start with Miller.
In 3 years? I will say yes. In 3 years. In 3 years, yes.
But not two.
Not two. No, definitely not two. Not before. No, it won't be before Congress until 2021 at the absolute earliest.
TPA expires in July.
And it expires in July 2021. So you're pulling up into, and in a lot of ways, when TPA was renewed previously, there were a lot of votes related to trade. There was a lot of focus that summer on trade. Squeezing it in before TPA would definitely be very smart. No, so when TPA was passed in 2015, there was a provision included that allowed for sort of a re-up, and I think that was in 2018. So no, there is no re-up after 2021.
Frank?
Your point is very important. First of all, I would agree with Mila generally. I think in 3 years you can do it. But this reference to TPA is very important because that is the I talked about this unique constitutional experiment. That is the mechanism by which any free trade agreement is approved, an up or down vote by Congress, more or less. I mean, there are exceptions to that in side agreements. But I think given how this administration has really irritated Congress, Democrats and Republicans, by what is viewed as an overreach on things like Section 232, a statute, by the way, which even trade lawyers in Washington maybe knew about, but never really could tell you the history of it because it was never utilized. And now it's gotten used to the point where Republicans in the Senate are saying we need to introduce legislation to give us a voice when you're talking about imposing a 25% tariff on automobiles and parts because they are a threat to the national security of the United States. So I think that that is extremely important as you're looking down the line in terms of where we're going in broader trade policy. But I would agree with me.
And just as, and I'm sure the congressman could speak firsthand as the experience, but the TPA vote in 2015 on its own was so close, right. Very close, and it failed the first time. Mm-hmm. So adding so much more to it is only going to make it that much more complex.
Great. I'll go to Ambassador Kirk now.
So,
I'm trying to I'm leaving the last word to the politician on the panel.
So I think it all depends on whether Britain has a Conservative government as a result of the next election or a Labour government. If we have a Conservative government, then I think the premium on getting a US FTA done will be very high, and so a lot of effort will go into doing it, and it will very likely happen. If we have a Labour government, then I think the negotiations get a lot more difficult because we will be having an experiment in sort of 1970s Marxist economic theory, which will be quite hard, I think, for the US.
We might have that here as well.
And I think issues like agri-foods and access to public services in particular, where a Conservative government could probably reach a sensible compromise that would be, publicly broadly acceptable. I think a Labour government would find that much, much harder to do.
Final word.
I think that it's possible that could happen in 3 years. It would also depend here on this side of the Atlantic who the president, who he or she is. It would also depend on who controls the House and the Senate. Putting trade promotion authority aside for a moment, the Congress can work its will. It can do whatever it wants if it so chooses to do so. So regardless of past legislation, if the Congress decides to pass the TPA, it can do it. And quite frankly, that's probably the only way in which these agreements do get done is to an up or down vote with the use of side letters to help. The one thing to keep in mind is that this particular agreement between Canada and Mexico was negotiated by the White House without the input of Congress, certainly not from the Democratic side of the aisle. And now with the election of Congress in the Democratic camp, and it now incumbent upon them to determine whether or not that bill comes to the floor or not, their actual imprimatur is being placed on the legislation itself. Similar to what happened in terms of the negotiations that had taken place on the Chorus Agreement and the Colombian Free Trade Agreements that were negotiated under the Bush administration, that when it came to the Obama administration, changes were made to have it be their agreement, basically. So no one should be shocked that Speaker Pelosi and Democrats are actually weighing in to try to change in ways they think are positive on the environment, on IP, on labor and enforcement. That's what's going to happen. How they can do that, in a sense, without opening the agreement up to then further negotiations again with Mexico and Canada is the trick. The one last thing I'll say about what Frank had mentioned, what does the price of steel have to do with the price of pigs? And the answer is everything when the chairman of the Finance Committee comes from the state of Iowa. And you impose a tariff on steel and aluminum, and in retribution, there is a tariff placed on the price of pork outside the states. And that's where you've seen the Republican majority in the Senate actually show some backbone against the president's movements here because it has hit home. And so I do think that at some point they're going to find a way in which they can pull back some of the authority they've given to the president on 232 and 301 so as to limit the ability of the president to take those actions and put them in the positions they did. But in answer to your question real quick, I think it's possible. It would depend on who's elected.
It's a great way to end it. Well, Matthew, Joe, Miller, Frank, thank you so much for sharing your insights today. Just to reiterate, it's going to be complex. You're going to need a global law and policy firm to guide you, and we can certainly recommend one of those. Thank you all for coming, for the great questions. We are just going to wheel in the drinks very shortly. I hope you'll be able to stay and share a cocktail with us and ask any more questions of the panel that you fancy. Thank you very much again. Enjoy your evening.